Hi, my name is James Cook. I'm an assistant professor of social science at the University of Maine at Augusta, and today we'll be talking about conformity as a sociological variable. This is distinct from the treatment of conformity that is most common in undergraduate level textbooks, in which conformity is thought of as a psychological variable, and usually the narrative goes somewhat like this. We like to think that we are free. However, when we find ourselves in social situations, we often conform to the expectations of others. Why, just look at Solomon Asch's experiment with lines. Why, just look at Stanley Milgram's experiment with shocks. Most of the people, even though they would have known better in other circumstances, said that certain lines actually matched each other when they didn't. And even though they were uncomfortable with it, and even were engaging in sweating and nervous laughter, and even telling people that they didn't want to engage in these shocking behaviors, they literally went ahead and shocked people. Wow, aren't we all conformists? I would like to argue, first of all, that this reliance on conformity as a constant is misguided, because the whole point of the Asch and Milgram experiments is that no, actually, we are not all conformists all the time. Conformity is a variable. It is something we can measure, and it varies in the extent that we can measure. Second point is that for both Asch and Milgram, the psychology of individuals is actually beside the point. It is despite individuals' misgivings. It is despite what they would otherwise normally do that they engage in these behaviors. And for both Asch and Milgram, the variables, the independent variables that predict the dependent variable of conformity, it's always some aspect of social structure, some way that they manipulate the environment around the individual. So that is a sociological way of thinking. Conformity, I would like to say, I'd like to argue, is a sociological variable. And I'd like to show you what I mean by those variables today, and we'll, in this video, be looking at the Asch and Milgram experiments. Not just video of them, but actual data from multiple experiments that Asch and Milgram carried out. To do that, we need to think about what conformity is. Within the sociological context, conformity is not simply equivalent to the dictionary definition. In the Random House Dictionary, there are multiple definitions of the word conformity, but they all have this passive aspect, which you will notice here. It's action in accord with prevailing social standards. It's correspondence in form. It's accordance with, it's compliance with, it's acquiescence. But there's never any subject in this, someone who is doing, right? It's always something that is being done. It's a passive voice. Conformity is an act. And it is an act that is not simply in compliance, I would like to argue, but involves a series of escalations. There are some kinds of conformity that happen, if we take the dictionary definition, that aren't really sociologically significant at all. I'd like to call that first form trivial conformity. It is behavior that follows expectations without the intervention of anybody else outside the individual. It's a behavior that you would engage in anyway. So, to give you an example, I could say right now, all right, I'm about to issue a command. At the count of 3, I command you to breathe. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Breathe. Now, if I wait here long enough, you're going to breathe, right? But you may be thinking at this point, that's trivial. I would have done that anyway. Exactly. We have to distinguish between behavior that a person would engage in and a behavior that a person would rather not engage. The second kind of conformity is a little bit more subtle. It has to do with socialization. What is the sort of behavior that a person would engage in normally anyway? Sometimes we have a compulsion, a nervous system compulsion to breathe. We literally cannot stop ourselves from breathing unless we do something really extreme. But Most often we choose to do things, but the very act of choosing is the end result of a long line of learning experiences in which we look at others, we come to understand what expectations they have for us, and then we learn to follow those expectations. We ingrain those expectations so much into our social selves that we have this voice inside our head, the expectations of others, and even when those literal others leave the room, at the end of the result of the process of socialization, we would do it anyway. Now that's a kind of conformity that is really profound and subtle. But that's not the kind of conformity, that subtle conformity that Asch and Milgram are studying. The third kind of conformity is one that is really what Asch is looking at. Solomon Asch, in his classic 20th century study, is looking at how people respond when the majority gives a clearly wrong answer regarding the match in length of two lines. When the majority disagrees with you, what will you do? Will you change what you do or not? That's a different kind of conformity. And then finally, Milgram has what I would say is really the highest level of conformity, which is conformity to authority. It is obedience to the demands of authority figures. And when a person would disagree with those demands otherwise, to do something, not just to say something, but to actually engage in an act with which the person does not agree. So, conformity to social pressure, Asch, conformity to the demands and commands of an authority figure, Stanley Milgram. These are the stronger forms of conformity, among the strongest that we would find, and therefore they would be the least commonly observed in society. And yet, the point is that social scientists observe this everywhere. They observe it absolutely everywhere. But let's not stop there. Let's not stop with the observation in Dalton Conley's text. You may ask yourself that, my goodness, people will conform when it comes to looking at lines. People will conform to the demands that they shock other people, apparently to death. That's a strong point. But the important point is that in each of these studies, some people did not. And both Asch and Milgram could get people to do it more, and they could get people to do it less. They were successful social engineers. And that means that they successfully observed conformity as a variable, a sociological variable. It's not a constant in society. And that's important because that means that we can change conformity within society. We can change conformity within ourselves if we are willing to and able to manipulate our social environment to that end. So it becomes incredibly important for us to understand these variables, right? And let's recall from earlier work in the Introduction to Sociology class that conformity here would be called the dependent variable because it is the outcome that we are interested in. And both Asch and Milgram assert that conformity, its value, depends on greater or lesser conformity on some independent variables. What are those independent variables? And how are they associated with more or less conformity? Let's start with Solomon Asch's work on social pressure, conformity to social pressure. You see here some lines. This is an image that is literally taken from his experiment and published in Scientific American in 1955. Which line on the right matches the line on the left? It seems pretty obvious. It should be obvious to you that it's number 2. But Solomon Asch got some people to say that it was either 1 or 3. An interesting outcome he was able to produce. So when someone engages in that act of reporting, they're engaging in an error. They produce an error. And whether the error is produced or a correct answer is produced is the dependent variable, and it's measured as the percent of time that an individual is in error, or conversely, at times in the reading that members of my class had, the percentage of the time that someone got it right, despite the presence of pressure. So if Solomon Asch it can produce variation in this dependent variable of conformity, he can make people more likely to engage in errors and less likely to engage in errors. How does he do it? That's what the independent variables describe. And the big four independent variables for Solomon Asch's work are the presence of opposition, of some individuals who disagree with you, the size of that opposition, the presence of an ally, someone who is willing to agree with you and give the right answer, and repetition. What happens when you do it over and over and over again? Let's take a look. And when we do this, let's take a look for contingent means. Now, if you're a student of mine in Introduction to Sociology at UMA, you know that we've talked about means before. A mean is an average. It's just another word for average. Well, if a mean is an average, then the whole point of a hypothesis in research is to say, hey, you know, I think that average is actually going to vary depending on what I do with my independent variable. I think the average of the dependent variable will change when I change my independent variable. Look for these. They're everywhere in social research, and they are everywhere in Asch's work and in Milgram's work. So here's one kind of variation. Actually, two kinds of variation. The first kind of variation is between the top line and the bottom line. The top line is the percent correct answers by those who are making judgments without pressure. Literally, there's nobody else in the room. Nobody's agreeing or disagreeing with you. You're just being asked to estimate which line matches with which other. Now, you'll notice that it's not a perfect 100%. In trials 2 and 4 and in trial 10, I believe if I'm looking correctly, there's one person who makes a mistake. Mistakes happen, but they happen, the point is, very, very, very rarely. And this is what we can expect people to do on their own. It sets what is, we'll talk about it later in the video, an interesting baseline. It's called a baseline is what you would expect without any kind of experimental treatment. Now the bottom line is what happens when individuals are faced with opposition. A set of other people in the room who are hired by the experimenter to do what? To disagree. To say that the line, some other line, that really doesn't match, does. Okay. And look at the difference. Now, a lot of people still give the right answer, right? Only occasionally dipping below 50%. But it's a long way away from 100%. There's a significant minority, anywhere from 20 to over half, 20 to 50%, who are going to change their minds. Okay? Really interesting difference. So that is one kind of independent variable, the presence or the absence of opposition, people who will say something that is just wrong. And notice, furthermore, that there's a second independent variable in here. Critical trials, notice there are 12 critical trials. One happens right after another. These are the ones in which an individual is faced with a majority that disagrees with them. And it happens 12 times. Look at the trend, which is denoted in that red line. That trend is one of increasing error over time. The first time, only 20% fail to give the correct answer. But by the end, that's much closer to 40%. The propensity to engage in error doubles as the grind of consistently coming up against a majority continues through 12 trials. And there's a fairly quick drop-off, and then it stays relatively stable after that. But there is a general decline. With repetition, subjects make fewer correct estimates. they conform more when they have to face that repetition. Here's a second independent variable, okay, and this is also from Solomon Asch's 1955 Scientific American Study. How many opponents do you have? Take a look at what happens if you have just one opponent, just one person who sometimes gets it wrong. Well, only 5% of the time, on average, right? This is an average for what Solomon Asch finds. On average, just about 5%, oh, maybe even 4%, engage in errors. But you kick that up to 3 people, right? Going from 1 to 3, and all of a sudden, you have a lot more error. You jump up to a 30% error. And after that, it pretty much stays the same. There's this big difference, right? 2's company, 3's a crowd. Well, if you get to that standard of a crowd, you get a lot more conformity. We are able to resist the social pressure from 1 individual. From 2 people, a little more. From 3 people, it becomes hard. And that's an important independent variable. Okay? What about just having one other person in the room who is willing to give the right answer? Of course, Solomon Asch is assigning this person to do so. Well, the top line is the percent correct when the subject has an ally, another person who's answering correctly. The bottom line is what happens when there is no ally. And in fact, you've seen that bottom line before, right? If you go back in the video, or you allow me to go back a little bit before, you see that line there. It's the bottom line. It's reproduced, but now Solomon Asch can reduce the error, can reduce the conformity to nonsense by just having one other person, an ally in the room, who's willing to say what is actually going on. That's very important to know. Just having one person to say the emperor has no clothes, and all of a sudden people are much more likely to agree with that, even when the majority does not. So lone dissenters are incredibly important. Finally, what happens in a very twisted way if between trial 6 and trial 7, that's why there's this gap in this picture, the partner either leaves the room, the ally, the person who was partnering up with that subject and giving the right answers, well, it looks like the error rate goes up. If you compare what's happening in trials 1 through 6 to those happening in 7 through 18 in this set of experiments. That's the bottom line. The top line, worse than an ally leaving, is when your ally or your partner actually turns on you and starts to conform. So that one of the worst things that can happen to your confidence is if your partner starts to agree with the majority. If your partner, that lone dissenter in the room, turns on you and gives in to conformity, that is crushing to your ability to, behaviorally speaking, give the right answer. People will engage in error by going along with the majority much more often. This huge jump when an ally defects to the other side, to the conformers. That also is really important to know if you want to avoid conformity or if you want to produce conformity in others. Well, let's move on from this conformity to social pressure, and let's think about Stanley Milgram's very literally shocking experiments regarding obedience to authority. Now, you should have read the description of Stanley Milgram's experiments that are brief. I am also here going to make reference to Stanley Milgram's 1974 book with HarperCollins, which is called Obedience to Authority, in which there is a larger number of experiments with a larger number of independent variables. So don't worry if you can't find all of these independent variables in your reading. If you want to learn more, get that book, Obedience to Authority by Stanley Milgram, 1974. A very inexpensive book, very important. So here the dependent variable is, in one sense, it can be measured as the maximum voltage shock that is administered by a subject. Do they go, this is measured in levels all the way from 1 all the way up to 30, where the 30, you'll recall, is the setting in the shock generator, the fake shock generator, that says maximum voltage XXXXX, far beyond severe shock and warning and danger. It's explained that this is something that can many research subjects felt that they were actually killing the individual in this experiment. Another way of thinking about the dependent variable that we'll look at in a few minutes is the percent who went all the way to the end. The percent who went all the way to the end. And that is a different kind of average, right? It's the percent who go all the way to the end versus the average maximum voltage that's delivered in terms of the level. So we'll look at both of those in just a minute, and we'll think about it in terms of a variety of independent variables. Okay. Here also look for contingent means. How the average of the dependent variable changes for different values of the independent variable we're looking at. How does the average value of the dependent variable, average level of conformity, change when we change the independent variable? So, to do so, we need a baseline. And that is an initial condition from which further experiments will deviate. The initial baseline that Stanley Milgram created was one in which the individual could not see, did not have to touch, could not even hear the individual who was being shocked. They only heard the buzz of the shock machine. And then found out there was so much conformity, he had to create some additional variables to try to reduce that conformity. When we think about deviations from the baseline, experimental conditions you can create to decrease conformity. What you're really doing, and you're setting up different experiments to see if you can get lower conformity if you do this, or lower conformity if you do that. You are working with hypotheses. In order to really know what you're doing, unless you're going to do completely random experiments, you're going to be working from research hypotheses. Educated guesses informed by theories of the way the world works that tell you how you think you ought to be able to decrease conformity. And so let's take a look at this, the actual results of experiments in which Stanley Milgram manipulates independent variables to try to decrease conformity, to try to increase dissent. And they're all drawn from his book, Obedience to Authority. Great book. So the first hypothesis, one which is covered in your reading, is the hypothesis that as the distance between the subject and the victim decreases, conformity also decreases. Okay. Two things you should notice. I've placed here in green the independent variable, and blue the dependent variable. Dependent variable is conformity. Independent variable is the distance between the subject and the victim. The person that the subject thinks is being shocked, right? We know they're not actually being shocked, but they think is being shocked. And then the person who's the real subject of the experiment, the one who's been brought in to deliver the shock. Now, what's the direction of effect that is proposed by this hypothesis, that is predicted by the hypothesis? Well, it is a positive relationship. A positive relationship occurs when the two variables vary together. So conformity goes down when the distance goes down. Conformity goes up when the distance goes up, right? The farther you are away from your target, the less you can see them, the less you have to touch them, the less you have to hear them, the greater the distance is, and Milgram predicts the greater the conformity. Let's look at the actual results. Now the top here is showing a decline. And how does the decline occur? It occurs as you become closer. Less conformity when you have less distance to your victim. The mean maximum shock, the average maximum shock delivered before the person finally not only says, I don't want to do this, but actually stops doing it, actually stops delivering the shock, is much lower. They stop at an earlier point when they have to touch. They stop much less often when they don't have to touch, when they don't have to hear, when they don't have to see. We also can look at the second kind of dependent variable Milgram provides, which is the percent who are wholly obedient, the percent who go all the way to that maximum level 30, beyond which there are no more levels to go up. 65%, if you can't see them, touch them, or hear them, the victims, 65% will go all the way. That's just about 2/3 of people will go all the way. With a little voice feedback, if you can hear their voices, it decreases the percent going all the way a little bit. Boy, proximity, if they're close to you, if they're in the same room and you can see them, that really decreases the mean maximum shock level. And if you have to actually put their hand on the shock plate, well, the set of people, the percentage of people who go all the way goes far down. So if you want to create a situation in which people are more free to follow their conscience, be sure that they can see the results of their action. If you want people to go along with you, what do? Make sure they can't see the consequences of their action, the action that you are commanding them to engage in. Very important if you're thinking about building a social structure, right? Think about it. Second hypothesis is that as the distance between the subject and the authority figure, the one issuing the commands to the subject, the experiment must continue, so on and so forth, you're required to shock this individual. As the distance between the subject, the one doing the shocking, and the authority, the one giving the commands, increases, the farther away they get, conformity will decrease. Now, what's the direction of the effect there? It's negative. As one goes up, distance goes up, conformity goes down. That's Milgram's hypothesis. What does he find? True. Okay, so distance goes up when the experimenter is absent from the room. When the experimenter is absent from the room, conformity goes down. The mean maximum shock level goes down from 24 out of 30 to 18 out of 30. That's a big difference out of 30, right? And the percent that are going all the way goes way, 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 way down. Now only 1 out of 5 will go all the way to the end when the experimenter is absent. When the experimenter is absent, people stop obeying the commands that the experimenter provided, that the authority figure provided before they went away. So, if you want to increase compliance, make sure that authority figures are ever present. If you want to allow people to dissent and follow their conscience, give them spaces in which authority figures are absent and they can exert their own self-control to a much more successful extent. So here's an interesting variable to consider, that of gender. It's important to notice that Stanley Milgram, in the middle of the 20th century, engages in research primarily, and first of all, with just men. This is reflecting an interesting cultural presumption that men should be the standard in research because they are the default, and that other people besides adult men, often adult white men, often adult white middle-class men, would be considered aberrant or deviant and would mess up the result. And so Stanley Milgram begins with white men, and only later thinks to himself, perhaps women would behave differently. Now, there are two competing hypotheses that Stanley Milgram describes in his book about how he thinks women possibly should behave, and he references previous psychological research to back up these claims. He's not just making them up. They're educated guesses. Now, the first is an empathy hypothesis that says women will be less likely to conform than men because women have a greater empathy for others, a greater care for others, a greater concern with the feelings of others than men do. On the other hand, women are seen by Stanley Milgram and psychologists at the time as more yielding, more willing to give in to social pressure, to give in to the desires of others. So, who does a woman empathize with, according to these hypotheses? According to the empathy hypothesis, they will empathize with the victim. According to the yielding hypothesis, they will be more likely to yield to the authority figure and therefore will be more likely to conform to the commands of others than men will be. Whereas men are seen as resistant, interested in showing dominance, and therefore less likely to go along. Two competing opposite hypotheses. What does Milgram find? Neither really describes the relationship that's going on here, which is no relationship. Men and women in his experiments deliver the same average maximum shock level out of 30, the same mean maximum shock, and exactly the same percent go right ahead to the end. Men and women, 65%. There is no gender difference that Stanley Milgram finds. And that is despite the fact that you may have thought of one of these two hypotheses, the empathy hypothesis and the yielding hypothesis, as reasonable, as perhaps even obvious, common sense. Don't trust your intuition. Sometimes your intuition may be wrong. That's why we do research. Finally, when subjects are given contradictory commands by two authority figures, not finally, but this is our second to last result, that they will be less likely to conform than when subjects are given commands by just one authority figure. Now, you'll notice that the dependent variable, conformity, can be summed up in just one word here, the blue word. But the independent variable has two states, just like the independent variable of gender had two states, men and women. Here, the two states are when there are two contradicting authority figures who give opposite commands versus just one authority figure who gives consistent commands, right? This is one variable. There are two possible states, and it is supposed to affect conformity. The idea is if authority doesn't have a consistent message, if it disagrees with itself, the person is less likely to go along. True. In a big way. Look at these results. The contingent means are different. The means depending on the different values of the independent variable. The result in red, okay, it shows the voice feedback option when there is just one authority figure. When there are two authority figures and they contradict each other, the average shock level that is delivered as a maximum goes down to 10, and 0% go all the way to the end. 0%. Compare that to 65%. Huge difference when authority does not agree with itself. So dissent among authority figures is an especially strong factor in predicting conformity. Now, how about this hypothesis? When subjects are given orders by a peer who is not an authority figure, Milgram says, I bet they're going to be less likely to conform. And he sets up this situation in which the experimenter, the authority figure in the room, wearing the lab coat, who is going to give the commands, has to take a call, and they have to leave the room. And so there is an additional person there who's supposed to be helping with the experiment, is supposed to be the timekeeper. And the timekeeper says, oh, I know what we'll do. We didn't get all the instructions, but this peer, just another person participating in the experiment, no authority, says, I know what we'll do. We'll increase the shock level as we go. Let's do that. Well, does the subject who has to deliver the shocks go with that command by a peer who is not an authority? How does it compare to when commands are given by the authority? Okay, we have the same result in red as we've had before, but now look, when you have voice feedback, so you can hear the victim, but you have a non-authority peer, just somebody who's saying, hey, this is what we'll do. Now, people do go all the way some of the time, but only 20%, just 1 in 5. Small minority, and the average shock level at a maximum where people stop is way down at 16.25. They do some shocking still, but they don't go quite as far. It's a big difference. This independent variable does impact the dependent variable of conformity. So authority matters, not just the presence of anyone giving commands, but the idea that the person giving commands is in charge and has legitimate authority matters. So figuring out who has authority, how they get authority, and who decides that they get to have that authority is important if you care about conformity in a society. These are all sociological variables, all ways you can set up society to increase or decrease conformity as a variable. So, to review, here's our independent variable review. Conformity to others' expectations is more likely when near unanimity is present, when authority figures are closer, when individuals have to act in public. This is part of the Asch experiment that is in your reading, but we haven't talked about in the video. When you can see, when you can hear the targets of the action, the victims, and when responsibility for the action is diffused. Okay. On the other hand, when responsibility for the action is assigned to the subject, it's up to you to decide. When you can see the targets, you can see the victims, you can hear them. When people can act privately, when they can either write down an answer or the experimenter leaves the room, so the authority figures are distant. When dissent by others is apparent, going back to Solomon Asch, then conformity goes down. So think about all these variables, put them together, and you can begin to think about micro-level questions and macro-level questions. Remember, in sociology, micro-level questions are questions about the individual. How does the individual exist? How does the individual act? How is the individual to behave? What can they expect? Here are some micro-level questions. In a politically charged environment, one where politics is all about what we should do, right? How can you ensure that your behavior in that charged environment where there are a lot of people with firm ideas, how do you know that you're not just going along? How do you know you're not conforming? How can you be sure? How can you test to see whether you're just going along with the crowd? How can you test to see whether your behavior actually reflects your individual beliefs? Think about those independent variables. Think about what you can do. There are some answers in there. How can you best avoid being manipulated by others? What strategy can you engage in so that you can avoid the conformist trap? How can you manipulate the social structure around you, in short, in order to minimize conformity and to maximize your own set of internal guiding principles, which may be the result of socialization, but still are an important part of your social sense of self. To thine own self be true. The social structure variables in the Asch and Milgram experiments provides some hints about that. But we're not just interested in micro-level questions, we're interested in macro-level questions, where macro questions are not about the individual, but really about how we would change the entire society. So you can imagine if you ran the zoo, if you were in charge, what would you do? How would you possibly structure society to create conditions that encourage conformity? Conformity has its benefits. It's much more efficient than everybody marching to their own drum. It's much more orderly, right? So you might want to increase conformity. On the other hand, innovation is the flip side. If you have too much conformity, you don't have creativity. You don't have people coming up with different ideas. You don't have people in a situation feeling comfortable expressing their interesting new ideas. And that can be stifling. So how can a society create conditions that discourage conformity and encourage innovation? Here too, the work of Stanley Milgram and Solomon Asch provide many clues, and those clues come in the form of independent variables. And the results provided by Stanley Milgram and Solomon Asch, as long as they are replicated through other research, give us a guide that's not just a story, it's not just a claim, it's a claim that's backed up by careful empirical observation, which again is the point of good sociological research.